Just then, a highly excited, breathless voice called down the table, "Hiya, Harry!" It was Colin Creevy, a third year, to whom was something of a hero. "Hi, Colin," said Harry wearily. "Harry, guess what? Guess what, Harry? My brother's starting. My brother Dennis." Good," said Harry. "He's really excited," said Colin, practically bouncing up and down in his seat. "I just hope he's in Gryffindor. Keep your fingers crossed, eh, Harry?" Yeah, all right," said Harry. He turned back to Hermione, Ron, and nearly headless Nick. "Brothers and sisters usually go in the same house, don't they?" he said. He was judging by the Weasleys, all 7 of whom had been put into Gryffindor. "Oh, no, not necessarily," said Hermione. "Parvati Patil's twin is in Ravenclaw, and they're identical. You'd think that they'd be together, wouldn't you?" Harry looked up and at the staff table. There seemed to be rather more empty seats than usual. Hagrid, of course, was still fighting his way across the lake with the first years. Professor McGonagall was presumably supervising the first years. The drying of the entrance hall floor, but there was another empty chair too, and he couldn't think who else was missing. "Where's the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher?" said Hermione, who was also looking up at the teachers. They had never yet had a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher who had lasted more than 3 terms. Harry's favorite by far had been Professor Lupin, who had resigned last year. He looked up and down the staff table. There was definitely no new face there. "Maybe they couldn't get anyone," said Hermione, looking anxious. Harry scanned the table more carefully. Tiny little Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was sitting on a large pile of cushions beside Professor Sprout, the herbology teacher, whose hat was askew over her flyaway grey hair. She was talking to Professor Sinistra of the astronomy department. On Professor Sinistra's other side was a sallow-faced, hook-nosed, greasy-haired potions master, Snape, Harry's least favorite person at Hogwarts. Harry's loathing of Snape was matched only by Snape's hatred of him, a hatred which had, if possible, intensified last year when Harry had helped Sirius escape right under Snape's overlarge nose. Snape and Sirius had been enemies since their own school days. On Snape's other side was an empty seat, which Harry guessed was Professor McGonagall's. Next to it, and in the very center of the table, sat Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster. His sweeping silver hair and beard shining in the candlelight, his magnificent deep green robes embroidered with many stars and moons. The tips of Dumbledore's long, thin fingers were together, and he was resting his chin upon them, staring up at the ceiling through the half-moon spectacles as though lost in thought. Harry glanced up at the ceiling, too. It was enchanted to look like the sky outside, and he had never seen it look this stormy. Black and purple clouds were swirling across it, and as another thunderclap sounded outside, a fork of lightning flashed across it. "Oh, hurry up," Ron moaned beside Harry. "I could eat a hippogriff." The words were no sooner out of his mouth than the doors of the great hall opened, and silence fell. Professor McGonagall was leading a long line of first years up to the top of the hall. If Harry, Ron, and Hermione were wet, it was nothing to how these first years looked. They appeared to have swum across the lake rather than sailing. All of them were shivering with a combination of cold and nerves as they filed along the staff table and came to a halt in a line facing the rest of the school. All of them except the smallest of the lot, a boy with mousy hair, who was wrapped in what Harry recognized as Hagrid's moleskin overcoat. The coat was so big for him that it looked as though he was draped in a furry black marquee. His small face protruded from over the collar, looking almost painfully excited. When he had lined up with his terrified-looking peers, he caught Colin Creevy's eye, gave a double thumbs up, and mouthed, "I fell in the lake." He looked positively delighted about it. Professor McGonagall now placed a three-legged stool on the ground before the first years, and, on top of it, an extremely old, dirty patched wizard's hat. The first years stared at it. So did everyone else. For a moment there was silence. Then a tear near the brim opened wide, like a mouth, and the hat broke into song. 1,000 years or more ago, when I was newly sown, there lived four wizards of renown, whose names are still well known. Bold Gryffindor from Wildmoor, fair Ravenclaw from Glen, sweet Hufflepuff from Valley Broad, shrewd Slytherin from Fen. They shared a wish, a hope, a dream. They hatched a daring plan to educate young sorcerers. Thus Hogwarts school began. Now each of these four founders formed their own house, for each did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. But Gryffindor the bravest were, by Gryffindor the bravest were, prized far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff hard workers were most worthy of admission, and power-hungry Slytherin loved those with great ambition. While still alive they did divide their favourites from the throng, yet how to pick the worthy ones when they were dead and gone? 'Twas Gryffindor who found the way, he whipped me off his head. The founders put their brains in me, so I could choose instead. Now slip me snug about your ears, I've never yet been wrong. I'll have a look inside your mind and tell where you belong. The great hall rang with applause as the Sorting Hat finished. That's not the song that it sang when it sorted us, said Harry, clapping along with everyone else. Sings a different one every year, said Ron. It's got to be a pretty boring life, hasn't it? Being a hat. I suppose it spends all year making up the next one. Professor McGonagall was now unrolling a large scroll of parchment. When I call out your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool, she told the first years. When the hat announces your house, you will go and sit at the appropriate table. Ackerley Stewart, a boy, walked forward, visibly trembling from head to foot, picking up the Sorting Hat, put it on, and sat down on the stool. Ravenclaw, shouted the hat. Stuart Ackerley took off the hat and hurried into a seat at the Ravenclaw table, where everyone was applauding him. Harry caught a glimpse of Cho, the Ravenclaw seeker, cheering Stuart Ackerley as he sat down. For a fleeting second, Harry had a strange desire to join the Ravenclaw table too. Baddock, Malcolm, Slytherin! The table on the other side of the hall erupted with cheers. Harry could see Malfoy clapping as Baddock joined the Slytherins. Harry wondered whether Baddock knew that the Slytherin house had turned out more dark wizards and witches and wizards than any other. Fred and George hissed Malcolm Baddock as he sat down. Branstone Eleanor, Hufflepuff, Caldwell Owen, Hufflepuff, Creevy, Dennis. Tiny Dennis Creevy staggered forward, tripping over Hagrid's moleskin, just as Hagrid himself sidled into the hall through a door behind the teacher's table, about twice as tall as a normal man and at least 3 times as broad. Hagrid, with his long, wild, tangled black hair and beard, looked slightly alarming. A misleading impression, for Harry, Ron, and Hermione knew that Hagrid to possess a very kind nature. He winked at them as he sat down at the end of the staff table and watched Dennis Creevy putting on the Sorting Hat. The rip of the brim opened wide. "Gryffindor!" the hat shouted. Hagrid clapped along with the Gryffindors as Dennis Creevy, beaming widely, took off the hat, placed it back on his head on the stool, and hurried over to join his brother. "Colin, I fell in," he said shrilly, throwing himself into an empty seat. "It was brilliant, and something in the water grabbed me and pushed me back to the boat." "Cool," said Colin, just as excitedly. "It was probably the giant squid, Dennis." "Oh, wow," said Dennis, as though nobody in their wildest dreams could hope for more than being thrown into a storm-tossed fathoms deep lake and pushed out of it again by a giant sea monster.